Age of Iron is a novel by South African author J.M. Coetzee, first published in 1990. It won the Sunday Express Book of the Year award and is set during the final years of Apartheid, a harsh system of racial segregation and oppression in South Africa that lasted from 1948 to the early 1990s. The story is narrated through a series of letters written by Mrs. Curren, a retired classics professor, to her estranged daughter who has moved to the United States in protest of apartheid. Mrs. Curren, who is white and financially secure, has recently been diagnosed with terminal cancer. After learning of her prognosis, she returns home to Cape Town, where she encounters a homeless man named Vercueil outside her house. Initially, she tries to drive him away, but when he returns, she reluctantly offers him food. She even suggests paying him to do some work around her home, but Vercueil takes offense and leaves in anger. Later that night, as Mrs. Curren suffers a painful episode related to her illness, Vercueil reappears and helps her back into the house without expecting anything in return. This act of kindness marks the beginning of a hesitant bond between them, which gradually deepens into a form of companionship. Mrs. Curren, who initially views Vercueil as an intruder, begins to defend his presence when neighbors complain, claiming he is her employee. Their relationship remains distant but functional, until one day Mrs. Curren asks Vercueil to mail her letters to her daughter after her death. Vercueil is reluctant at first, perhaps unsettled by the gravity of the request, but he eventually agrees. During this period, Mrs. Curren's black housekeeper, Florence, returns from a trip, bringing her children, Becky, Hope, and Beauty, with her. Mrs. Curren is especially uneasy about Becky, who spends time with boys she considers delinquents. Becky, however, has no other options, as the schools in his township, Gugulethu, have been closed by the state. One of Becky's friends, who goes by the name John, gets into a scuffle with Vercueil, driving the homeless man away for a while. Meanwhile, Mrs. Curren begins to notice police surveilling her house, likely keeping an eye on Becky and John. When she tries to intervene and explain that the boys pose no threat, the officers dismiss her in a way that leaves her feeling disregarded. As tensions rise, Vercueil returns, this time with a woman, both of them heavily intoxicated, adding another layer of complexity to the interactions within Mrs. Curren's household. Upon discovering Vercueil and a woman passed out in her living room, Mrs. Curren is overwhelmed with panic at the unexpected invasion of her space. Later, she witnesses police officers confronting Becky and John as they ride their bikes, causing a violent collision with a plumbing truck. Both boys sustain serious injuries, prompting Mrs. Curren to rush into the street to offer them comfort while waiting for an ambulance. This incident marks a pivotal moment for Mrs. Curren, as she begins to grasp the depth of the racism and police brutality pervasive in her society. At the hospital, Mrs. Curren, in too much pain to enter, waits in the car with Vercueil. She confides her fear of mailing the letters to her daughter, revealing her struggle to communicate her terminal diagnosis. Vercueil offers her comfort, but warns that failing to share the truth may lead her daughter to resent her for not allowing a proper farewell. One night, a woman calls to inform Florence that Becky is in trouble. With Vercueil passed out and unresponsive, Mrs. Curren accompanies Florence and her daughters to Gugulethu, where a riot has erupted. Amid the chaos of flames and casualties, Mrs. Curren experiences a panic attack, only to be confronted by Florence's cousin, Mr. Thabane, who criticizes her for her privilege and naivety. When they finally find Becky, he is among 5 young black men who have been brutally murdered, their mouths stuffed with sand, while the police show indifference. Following a harrowing contemplation of suicide with Vercueil, an argument causes him to vanish for a time. When John comes to her door looking for Becky, Mrs. Curren takes him in, driven by a mix of pity and loneliness. One night, the police arrive searching for John, and although Mrs. Curren insists everything is fine, the officers refuse to leave. Fearing for John's safety, she keeps him close, but when a female officer distracts her, the others seize the opportunity to shoot John, killing him. Traumatized and unable to remain in her home, Mrs. Curren wanders the streets and eventually falls asleep under a bridge. When she awakens, she finds children rummaging through her belongings for valuables. Vercueil locates her and convinces her to return home, but upon arrival, they discover the house has been burglarized, vandalized, and left in disarray. As Mrs. Curren's health declines, Vercueil holds her in bed, not in a sexual manner, but simply to provide warmth. One morning, she awakens alone, feeling colder than ever. When Vercueil joins her in bed, she finds no warmth from him and wonders if this might be the day she dies. Age of Iron is a stark yet powerful novel that chronicles one woman's awakening to the injustices surrounding her. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a like if you did, and be sure to subscribe. Thank you.